Hi, everyone. I'm Omar Villafranca. Thank you for joining us. The House of Representatives voted Monday to approve an increase in coronavirus stimulus checks from $600 to $2,000. The plan has the backing of President Trump, who voiced support for the idea after signing the latest COVID relief and funding bill. It remains unclear if Senate Republicans would approve that. The president had threatened to refuse signing a $900 billion coronavirus relief bill unless the direct payments were increased before reversing course and signing the legislation Sunday night. Meanwhile, President-elect Joe Biden is blasting the Trump administration over what he called roadblocks in the transition process. He says the Trump administration is not giving his team information in key national security areas. CBS News White House correspondent Paula Reid has the latest.
President-elect Biden tonight calling out the Trump administration for failing to brief his transition team, warning that nothing must get lost in the transfer of power.
We just aren't getting all the information that we need for the outgoing administration. It's nothing short, in my view, of irresponsibility.
Mr. Biden specifically pointed to political appointees at the Department of Defense and Office of Management and Budget, who he said were engaged in obstruction. President Trump, meanwhile, was spotted on his golf course in Palm Beach. His decision to wait to sign the COVID relief bill until last night leaves 14 million Americans without unemployment benefits through at least the end of the year. Siobhan Anderson, furloughed since March, and his wife were counting on those benefits, which expired on Saturday night.
We're just out here, struggling to survive and keep food in our refrigerators and in our shelves.
Those benefits will now kick in early next month, while the Treasury Department said $600 stimulus checks going to those individuals making up to $75,000 and $1,200 checks for couples making up to $150,000 could still go out this week.
I am asking Congress to amend this bill and
President Trump is still demanding that stimulus checks be increased to $2,000, but most of his Republican allies have no interest in doing so. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called on the president to persuade them to get on board.
He talked about it. Now she's got to act. People need the money.
Tonight, the House voted to override President Trump's veto of a $740 billion defense bill. The president vetoed the legislation because it did not include a provision that would curtail protections for social media companies. Now, if the Senate does the same thing tomorrow, it will be the first override of the Trump administration. Omar.
Paula Reid, thank you. For more, let's bring in Jill Colvin and Siobhan Hughes. Jill is a White House reporter for the Associated Press. She's traveling with the president in West Palm Beach, Florida. And Siobhan is a Capitol Hill reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Jill, the president was against this deal, yet he ended up signing it at the last minute. Did he gain anything politically by waiting?
Well, that's a big question that I think we're still waiting for the answer to right now. For the last number of days since the president arrived in Florida here for his holiday vacation, there has been so much tension, so much frustration directed at him over his foot dragging of signing this legislation. We had a situation where you had millions of people who lost access to certain unemployment benefits. We were right on the cusp of a government shutdown as we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And there was a lot of concern that the president might not sign this bill. Of course, he decided to at the last minute, facing enormous pressure from members of both parties. And the question now is whether he was able to get anything out of it. It had seemed last night like he likely wouldn't. Republicans, of course, had fought Democrats about the amount of aid that individuals will receive. A lot of Republicans thought that $600 was enough money. Democrats wanted more. And so that was the deal that they reached. We've seen in the House vote, though, tonight that, in fact, several dozen Republicans wound up siding with the president. And so you have a really interesting situation here where you've got the president, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and Democratic leaders on one side, and then Republicans who are reluctant to provide more spending. And so we'll wind up seeing what happens in the Senate.
All right. Well, Siobhan, let me ask you that. This is something the president supports. Is there any sense that it'll pick up any steam in Mitch McConnell's Republican-controlled Senate?
There is no evidence that the $2,000 in direct aid is going to pick up any steam in the Senate. Tomorrow, the Senate is in session. You are likely to see Senator Chuck Schumer go to the floor to ask that the House-passed bill be brought up for a vote. You are just as likely to see a Senate Republican object to that, meaning Mitch McConnell would have to use up the dwindling amount of time left this Congress to try to bring that bill to a vote. Mr. McConnell really is the person who is in the hot seat here. It is unclear whether Mr. Trump got anything out of his demands, but one thing is clear. He has put Mitch McConnell in a very uncomfortable position, not only as a leader, somebody who potentially could be standing in the way of the $2,000 checks going to most Americans, but also as somebody who is trying to hold on to 2 seats from Georgia. And so there's this question about whether or not what Mitch McConnell does ends up damaging the prospects of the 2 Republicans, Senator Kelly Loeffler and Senator David Perdue, who are up for re-election on January 5th.
Siobhan, let me stick with you. This bill is really only a stopgap measure, and the current session of Congress ends, I believe, January 3rd. What happens when the new Congress is sworn in, and what approach is the Biden administration going to have on moving forward towards possibly another bill? There's a chance, I guess, to look into the crystal ball.
So Joe Biden's #1 priority when he comes into the presidency next year will be to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. And a component of that are the economic consequences. He's going to be faced with a series of cliffs. For example, an eviction moratorium in that COVID aid bill ends on January 31st. There is an extra $300 a week in unemployment checks. That expires on March 14th. And so he is very quickly going to be faced with a series of decisions about what he wants to include in a new bill and the duration of those benefits, keeping in mind, of course, that we do have a vaccine, but the distribution is very limited, and he doesn't know, no one really knows, at what point the economy is going to come back as the pandemic subsides.
Jill, as Paula Reid mentioned in her piece, President-elect Biden Monday addressed some of the ongoing issues his team has had with the transition process. Acting Defense Secretary Miller put out a statement Monday night saying the Department of Defense has conducted 164 interviews, over 400 officials, and provided over 5,000 pages of documents, far more than requested by the Biden transition team. What do you make of all this, especially this late in the game? I mean, it's almost January.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been concerns about this now ongoing for several weeks. We had the president who, of course, spent weeks delaying the beginning of the transition process during that time when the Biden team was begging for access to information, not just to national security information, but also to details about vaccine distribution. They want to be able to come in there and get started on day one and need to know what the situation is. And we've heard reports, especially from the Pentagon, of a lot of slow walking from the Trump administration of messages and back and forth confusion about the extent to which government officials there, especially political appointees, are being permitted to have discussions with the Biden team, especially over this holiday period. Biden clearly making the case tonight that he's concerned and that they feel like they're not getting the kind of access that they need. But you've also got a president who appears intent on spending the final weeks of his administration doing everything he can, kicking and screaming to try to throw doubt on these election results and make these charges of that the election was somehow rigged against him, of course, against any credible evidence.
And Jill, on that note, I also want to ask you about a lawsuit filed by a Texas Republican Congressman Louis Gohmert and Arizona Republican electors against, not a typo here, against Republican Vice President Mike Pence. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is really an extraordinary lawsuit, and I think it just shows you the sort of extreme measures that allies of the president are willing to take right now as they basically try to throw anything they can against the wall when it comes to lawsuits, when it comes to disinformation and various allegations out there trying to make something stick. Every constitutional scholar that I've seen quoted has made very clear that this is not a thing. Of course, we know that on January 6th, Congress will convene. The vice president's role has typically been sort of a symbolic role, standing up there as they tally the votes of the Electoral College, and that is the final step in the process. But what you've seen over the last couple of weeks as their lawsuits have failed, as all of their other attempts have been shut down one after the next, that this January 6th date is sort of the final date that they've circled in their calendars, the final time when Trump supporters and those who are not willing to give up on this fight feel like this is their last-ditch effort. The president is currently encouraging them all to come to Washington, D.C. to protest on his behalf. We saw what happened when that happened last month, where there was a bunch of violence and a series of stabbings. So we don't think there's any chance that this lawsuit goes anywhere, but it really just shows the lengths that they're going to right now.
Never a dull moment in West Palm Beach or Washington, D.C. Jill Colvin, Siobhan Hughes, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.